5 women tried to be his wife. Every single one fled in less than 7 days. The last one walked 8 miles through the scorching desert. She told the townsfolk she would rather die in that heat than spend one more night under his roof. She said he was half savage, that his house was filled with devil worship, and that he looked at her like she was already a ghost. So when 32-year-old Ruth Brooks stepped off that stagecoach, a widow who had already buried a husband and 3 children, everyone just started counting down the days. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. Elias Crow was half Apache, half white. A man so haunted by the death of his first wife that he had forgotten how to let anyone in. A man so terrified of loss that he had built a prison out of love, and every woman he tried to save had run from it. But Ruth wasn't looking for a savior. She was looking for a partner. The question was, could she survive past day 7? And what dark truth had driven all the others away? Real love isn't about protecting someone from life. It's about trusting them enough to face it together. This story proves that 2 broken people don't make a disaster. They make a partnership, if they're brave enough to stop controlling and start trusting. If you believe in building something real instead of waiting for a fairy tale, drop a comment telling me what you've chosen to fight for. And if you want more stories about imperfect people finding their way to each other, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Your support means everything. The stagecoach left Ruth in a cloud of dust. She was 32 years old, which was considered ancient for a mail-order bride. Her dress was clean but patched. Everything about her suggested a woman who knew survival was an art. The driver, a man named Polk, wouldn't even meet her eyes. He had seen too many women make this same mistake. "Are you certain about this, ma'am?" he asked. Ruth stepped down into the dust without his help. "I am certain I'm here, Mr. Polk. That is all that matters for now." He just pointed a thumb toward the mountains. "The Crow Ranch is 8 miles north. He will either come for you or he will not." The stagecoach rattled away, leaving her alone with her trunk. The door of the general store creaked open, and a woman with suspicious eyes stepped out. "You must be the new one," she stated. "I am Ruth Brooks. I have an arrangement with Mr. Elias Crow." The woman, Mrs. Bledsoe, gave a harsh laugh. "An arrangement? You know about the others, I suppose." "I know that 5 women came before me, and they all left," Ruth said. "Left is a nice way to put it," Mrs. Bledsoe scoffed. "Mary Hutchkins walked back to town, 8 miles in the August heat. Said she would rather die in the desert than spend one more night in that man's house." Ruth's face remained a calm mask. She had learned long ago not to show her feelings. "Did she say why?" "Said he was half savage, that his house was filled with devil worship and spirits. She said he looked at her like she was already gone." Mrs. Bledsoe leaned in, ready to share more. "You seem like a practical woman, Miss Brooks. So let me be practical. Go back. Whatever you are running from cannot be worse than what is waiting for you at the Crow Ranch." Ruth met her gaze without flinching. "That is very kind of you, but I do not run from things anymore. I run toward them." Before Mrs. Bledsoe could argue, a sudden quiet fell over the street. Conversations stopped. People found reasons to be somewhere else. A horse was approaching. On it sat a man who looked like he was carved from the same stone as the mountains. It was Elias Crow. He was tall, with broad shoulders and skin the color of old copper. His father was a scout from Pennsylvania, his mother, Chiricahua Apache. The mix of blood gave him sharp cheekbones and eyes so dark they looked black. She noticed he wore no gun on his hip, only a knife. He stopped his horse 20 feet away and just looked at her. In that moment, Ruth understood why the other women had run. His gaze was not cruel, but it was absolute. It made you feel like he could read every secret you ever had. "Miss Brooks," his voice was a deep rumble. "Mr. Crow," Ruth replied, her voice steady. "You are older than I expected," he said. "And you are exactly as described," she countered. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was not a smile, but it was close. He dismounted and lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. securing it to his saddle. Up close, she saw a thin scar at his temple and the hard calluses on his hands. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Not well," Ruth admitted, "but I can learn." He nodded, seeming satisfied. "The wagon comes once a month. For today, you ride with me." He swung back onto the horse and offered her a hand. She took it and let him pull her up behind him. She had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist. She could feel the hard muscle of his back and smell leather, horse, and sage smoke. As they rode out of town, the desert opened up around them in shades of brown and gold. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Ruth focused on holding on not thinking about the man whose last 5 brides had fled in terror. Finally, Elias spoke, pointing to a line of green trees. "Water," he said. "It feeds the ranch. Without it, this place dies." "Is the ranch near the water?" she asked. "Half a mile downstream. Close enough for the pipe I built." "Who built the pipe system?" "I did, 3 years ago." "Before or after your first wife?" she asked. She felt him go completely still. The comfortable quiet between them was gone, replaced by a tense silence. "After," he finally said. "Long after." Ruth filed the information away. The letters had only said he was a widower. The other women had whispered that his first wife was Apache, that he had loved her so fiercely that any woman after would feel like a ghost in her own home. "That's your loss," Ruth said, and she meant it. "It was a long time ago. Grief has its own clock, Mr. Crow." He shifted in his saddle to look at her, and his tough exterior seemed to crack just a little. "Everyone's lost someone. What matters is if you let it break you or build you. Which was it for you?" "Both," Ruth said, her voice steady. "But I am still here." Elias gave a slow nod. "Another hour to the ranch. When we get there, I will show you the house and the work. Then we will see if you last longer than the others." There was no challenge in his voice, just a plain fact. "I will last, Mr. Crow. You can bet on it." The ranch appeared suddenly, nestled in a bend of the Arroyo River. Ruth had pictured a rough bachelor's cabin. Instead, she saw a solid adobe home, built in the old Spanish style to stand against the heat. This place was not just surviving, it was built to last for generations. "You built all this?" she asked. "Some. The rest was already here. It belonged to a Mexican land grant family gone 20 years now. I bought it from the bank and fixed her up." Elias dismounted and helped her down. "Your room is on the south side. Mine is on the north." Separate rooms. Ruth felt a quiet relief. "This place demands work from sunup to sundown," he said, not looking at her. "I cannot afford a woman who thinks this is a hotel. The others, they wanted to be treated like delicate china. I do not need that. I need a partner, Miss Brooks. Someone who understands that out here, everyone works to survive." Ruth put down her small bag. "Mr. Crow, I am not delicate china. I am 32 years old. I have buried a husband and 3 children. I spent 5 years running a boarding house in St. Louis that would have broken most folks. I came here because I'm tired of building someone else's dream. I want my own land and my own life." She took a deep breath. "I do not know your ways yet, but I learn fast. What I do know is hard work. I know how to solve problems, and I do not run when things get tough. So you tell me what needs doing, and I will do it. But do not ever think I am here to be managed. I am here to build something. The only question is if you are ready for that." The silence was so deep Ruth could hear the wind in the cottonwood trees. Then Elias Crow smiled. The smile changed his whole face, wiping away the hardness. "Come on," he said, grabbing her trunk. "I will show you the house. We will start with the chickens. They are the least likely to kill you." The house was cool inside. The main room had a big stone fireplace and sturdy handmade furniture. Beautiful woven blankets in shades of red, black, and white hung on the walls. "My mother's work," Elias said. "She taught me to weave, said it teaches you patience." He put her trunk by a door. "Your room. It is not much, but it is yours. We eat simple here." The room was plain but clean. A single bed was covered with another of the beautiful blankets. On the windowsill, someone had placed a small jar of desert wildflowers. "Did you put these flowers here?" Ruth asked. Elias looked a little awkward. "Seemed like something a lady might like." "It is thoughtful. Thank you." He just nodded. "Get into your work clothes. Meet me outside in 10 minutes. After he left, Ruth stood in the quiet room. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. She had no family to go back to. For the first time in 3 years since the fever had taken her family, she felt something more than just tired. She felt alive. She changed into an old dress and went outside, ready for whatever came next. The chickens, as he promised, were easy enough. She learned how to feed the 17 birds, how to gather their eggs, and how to watch her ankles around the mean rooster. Next was the milk cow, a calm animal named Bella. Milking was clumsy at first, but she soon found a rhythm. "You're a good girl, Bella," she murmured. "She likes you," Elias said from the barn door. "She usually kicks strangers." "I am good with stubborn females," Ruth answered, her focus on the pail. "We understand one another." The afternoon was a whirlwind of lessons. Elias showed her the garden, the smokehouse for preserving meat, and the root cellar that kept vegetables through the winter. He pointed out the good grazing pastures and warned her about flash floods and rattlesnakes. "You getting all this?" he asked as the sun began to set. "Most of it. What I forget, I will ask about." The others never asked questions. They just looked scared. Ruth stood up straight, wiping sweat from her brow. "Mr. Crow, I need you to hear me. I am not the others. That is their story. In my story, I ask questions until I understand. Because understanding is the only power worth having." Elias just stared at her. "You are different than I expected." There was a new sound in his voice. It might have been surprise, but it sounded a whole lot like approval. That first night, Ruth made a simple supper in her new home. Elias had a well-stocked kitchen, and she put it to good use. She cooked beans with salt pork and baked cornbread in a skillet. They ate at a rough kitchen table as darkness fell outside. Elias ate quietly but cleaned his plate. A silent compliment in this quiet place. "You can cook," he finally said. "Did you think I could not?" she replied. He almost smiled. The last one burned water. After she cleaned up, Ruth sat on the porch, feeling the day's hard work in her bones. Her body, unused to ranch labor, ached all over. But she had made it through day 1. Elias found her there. "You should get some sleep," he said, not unkindly. "Tomorrow starts before the sun." He hesitated in the doorway. "Ruth," he began, testing her name, "I want you to know this is a hard life. I am not an easy man. If you want to leave by the end of the week, I will take you back to town myself. No questions asked." Ruth stood and faced him in the starlight. "Is that what you want, Elias? For me to leave?" He shook his head. "I want you to choose, not because you are trapped." She stepped closer. "I am desperate, I will not lie. I have nothing to go back to. But I came here to build something. I see a man who works hard, who is honest, and who treats his animals with kindness. That is more than most men offer." She looked him square in the eye. "So no, I will not be leaving. Not because the work is hard, or because folks in town whisper about you. I will only leave if you tell me to go. Otherwise, I am staying." For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then he gave a single sharp nod. "7 days," he said. "The others never made it past 7. If you are still here on day 8, we will talk about making this permanent." She smiled faintly. "I will give you 7 days to get used to the idea." Her second day started in the dark. Elias had coffee ready, and they rode out to check the cattle as the sky turned gray. He showed her how to count the herd, how to spot a sick animal, how to read the language of the ranch. It was a whole new world for her. Later, they found a section of downed fence. "This needs fixing before the herd wanders off," Elias said, swinging down from his horse. "I can help," Ruth offered. He looked at her dusty dress and soft hands. "Ever use a hammer?" "For 5 years in a boarding house. I am not an expert, but I can manage." That earned her a real smile. The work was brutal. Ruth held the heavy rails steady, while Elias drove the posts, her arms trembling with the strain. She refused to stop for rest. When they finished, the fence was strong again. Elias looked at her blistered hands and sweat-soaked dress with a new kind of respect. "You are tougher than you look," he said. "Most things worth having are," she replied. The days fell into a rhythm of hard work. Ruth learned the quiet ways of Elias. She learned he sang softly to the cattle in the mornings, and that he worried constantly about having enough water. Elias, in turn, learned about Ruth. He learned she was a quick study, asking endless questions, but never the same one twice. He learned she could work beside him in comfortable silence. On the 4th day, they found a dead snake fouling a water tank. "Damn it," Elias muttered. "That is a half-day's work to drain and scrub." Ruth studied the problem. "What if we siphon the water for the garden? Then we only need to scrub and refill it." Elias stared at her. "That would work. Why did I not think of that?" "Because you are one person doing the work of 3, she said simply. "That is what partners are for." That evening, Elias spoke first at the dinner table. "Why did you leave the boarding house?" he asked. "The owner died," she explained. "His son sold the place, and I had 2 weeks to find a new life. At my age, that is not an easy thing. The matrimonial agency was my last hope." He nodded. "What in my letter made you come all this way?" "It was honest," she said. "You did not promise an easy life. You promised a partnership. Your husband, he was not honest?" "My husband was a good man, but grief destroyed him after our children died from the fever. Some losses are too big for one person to carry." Elias was quiet for a long time. "My wife was Apache," he said softly. "Her name was Deste. She died giving birth to our first child. The baby died with her. It was 9 years ago." The pieces clicked into place for Ruth. "The other women, they wanted you to forget her." "They wanted me to erase her," he corrected. "They ran because I could not love them the way they wanted. Every time I looked at them, I saw all that I had lost." He finally met her eyes. "And when you look at me?" she asked. He considered her for a moment. "I see someone who understands that you can honor the dead and still build a life with the living." This was not a romance, but something true, and Ruth could build a life on truth. On day 5, 3 riders approached at a gallop. Elias came from the barn, his hand near the pistol he had strapped on. He ordered her inside, recognizing Bledsoe from the general store. But Ruth stayed on the porch as the man, his wife, and a stranger rode up. Bledsoe called out to check on Miss Brooks. "It is Mrs. Crow," Ruth said firmly. "We were married by common law 3 days ago." Mrs. Bledsoe pleaded, saying 4 other women had left this place broken. She wanted Ruth to know she had a way out. Ruth thanked her but stood her ground. "I am here by choice, and I am staying." The third man spat tobacco. "He is a savage, lady. That blood will tell." She felt the rage build in Elias and placed a steadying hand on his arm. "I will handle this," she said, her voice pure ice. "Get off our land, now." As they rode away, Elias covered her hand with his own. "You called me your husband." She met his eyes. "They do not fear for me, Elias. They are offended by you. There is a difference." His face changed. "The others always believed their stories." "Then the others were fools." The next morning, a note said Elias was out on the range. Around noon, a coyote broke into the chicken coop. Ruth grabbed a stick and ran toward the chaos. 2 hens were already dead. She attacked the predator, which dropped its prey and turned on her, teeth bared. It lunged and she fought back, but the animal was quick and circled her. A rifle shot cracked the air and the coyote dropped. Elias stood 30 feet away, his face pale with terror. He rushed to her, frantically checking for wounds. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, "but it killed 2 chickens." "Damn the chickens!" he yelled, pulling her into a fierce, shaking hug. "You could have died." "And lose good hens?" she retorted. "You are insane." "I'm practical." He held her tight. "Please do not risk yourself like that again." "Then you had better fix that fence," she said. After they had secured the coop, Ruth finally admitted how scared she had been. Elias grew serious. "I need to tell you why the others left this place." He confessed that he had tried to shield the other women from every hardship. "I thought I was giving them protection." "That is a prison, not protection," Ruth told him. He realized he had smothered them, terrified of failing them like he believed he had failed his first wife. "But you are different," Elias said. "You want a partner, and I have forgotten how to be one." "Then we can learn again, together," she promised. "Tomorrow is day 7, he said quietly. "Will you be here for day 8? "I will be here for day 800, she answered. "But we will make it legal. I want my name on the property deed." He stared, then nodded slowly. "Partnership. We will ride to town tomorrow." Later, he noted that no other woman had stayed this long. Ruth put down her fork. "Elias, I am not the others. It is time you believed that." That night, Ruth lay thinking how 7 short days had changed her whole world. She had arrived in this town with everyone expecting her to run. Now she was in a house that felt like home, married to a man she was beginning to trust. She heard Elias stop outside her door and knock softly. "Ruth, are you awake?" He just wanted to thank her for staying, he said, for seeing the man he was, not the monster everyone else saw. Ruth opened the door. "I see a man who works honestly and loves deeply," she said. "If they cannot see that, it is their failure, not yours." That night, for the first time since losing her children, she fell asleep with a heart full of hope. The next morning, Elias was already dressed, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. "I thought we could ride to town," he said. "Get the marriage made legal." Ruth simply smiled. "Let me get ready." They rode into Dry Hollow to the same whispers and stares that had met her a week ago. But this time, Ruth walked with her head held high, Elias at her side. In the general store, Mrs. Bledsoe's eyes went wide. "Miss Brooks, you are still here." "It is Mrs. Crow now," Ruth corrected her gently. "And we have come to make it legal." The older woman's surprise turned into a kind of grudging respect. She told them the circuit judge was in town. As they left, Mrs. Bledsoe called out, "Mrs. Crow, I owe you an apology. We were wrong about you." She looked at Elias. "Maybe we have been wrong about other things too." The judge was a practical man. In under 10 minutes, the vows were read and the papers were signed. The property deed now carried both their names. They were husband and wife. After buying flour and coffee, they rode out of town, leaving the whispers behind them. On the ride home, Elias looked out at the land. "Day 8 starts tomorrow." Ruth shook her head. "No, day 8 starts now. The moment we filed those papers, this became real. We are not testing this anymore, Elias. We are building it." He looked at her, and for the first time a true smile reached his eyes. They returned to a storm gathering over the mountains. "We have to secure the ranch," Elias stated. After a week together, they worked in perfect unison. She shuttered windows as he brought in the livestock. They finished just as the downpour started. The storm hit with incredible force. Over the roar, Elias asked if she was afraid. "No," she answered, feeling truly alive. "I thought I needed someone who would not run away," he admitted. But I really needed someone who runs toward things. I ran toward possibility, she said. You were part of it. Good enough for me, he replied. The storm continued all night. I'm glad you are here, Elias said. I'm glad I came. After midnight, it was over. They surveyed the damage by moonlight. It could be worse, he said. We were prepared, not lucky. Ruth reflected on her past. I spent 3 years running from grief, she admitted. I thought coming here was still running. But maybe I ran far enough to finally stop. This life did not erase her loss, but it gave her a future. I am here as your wife, she stated. He took her hand. And I am here as your husband. As the sun rose, they went to work. The following weeks brought a comfortable rhythm. Ruth learned Elias sang old Apache songs when he thought he was alone. She saw he could track a single calf over miles of rock and that he had a deep fear of wildfire. In turn, Elias learned about her nightmares of the children she lost. He saw how sharp her mind was with numbers, able to calculate costs in her head. He learned she hummed quietly while she worked. They fell into a routine, sharing their work but not yet their deepest thoughts. They were partners in labor but still strangers in heart. Their work divided naturally based on their skills. Elias handled the cattle and heavy labor. Ruth managed the household, the garden, and the finances. They worked well side by side, communicating without many words. Yet they remained distant in the ways that truly mattered. They shared a house, but not their inner lives. The distance between them was a silent, heavy thing. A letter from St. Louis started to change that. Ruth picked it up on her monthly supply run to town. It was from her old friend Margaret. She waited until she was home alone at the ranch to finally open it. The letter brought devastating news from her friend Margaret. The same fever that took Ruth's children 3 years ago had returned to St. Louis. It was killing families she knew, children she had cared for. Ruth read the words over and over. A wave of guilt washed over her. She had escaped, while others were dying. Surviving felt like a heavy burden. Elias found her at the kitchen table as the sun set, the letter in her hand, her face wet with tears. They had always kept a careful distance from each other's pain, but he could not retreat from the sight of her breaking apart. "Ruth?" he asked gently. She looked up, her face filled with anguish. "The fever is back," she said, her voice cracking. "It is killing people I knew." Elias told her about the sickness back home. "I should be there helping," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "But I am here, safe, while people I knew are dying." "You cannot save everyone," Ruth said. And with those words, 3 years of her own grief burst out. "I could not save my children. I watched them burn with fever. Then my husband, he just gave up and drank himself into the grave. I could not save anyone who mattered." She was sobbing now, a raw and painful sound. Elias moved quickly, pulling her into his arms and holding her tight. "You saved yourself," he said quietly into her hair, "and that counts. Surviving is the hardest thing there is. Do not ever think it is not." She pulled back to look at him. "How do you keep going?" He met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a familiar pain. "I almost did not," he confessed. "After my wife and baby died, I spent a whole year trying to drink myself into the ground, just like your husband did. My uncle came and pulled me back from that same darkness. He stayed out here for 6 long months, working the ranch with me, refusing to let me sink. He told me any fool can die. It is the living that takes true grit. That is how I honor my death day, by surviving." Elias looked at her, his voice soft but steady. "The same is true for you. You honor your family by living well, not by letting their memory bury you." Ruth finally broke, resting her head on his shoulder as the tears came. "I am just so tired of the grief." "I know," he said, holding her tight. "But the weight gets lighter when someone helps you carry it." She cried until she was empty, and he just held her. In the quiet darkness of the kitchen, she finally pulled away. Do not you apologize for having feelings. We all crack now and then. The real test is putting yourself back together. You are a lot wiser than you let on, she managed. I have had practice, he said, standing to put the kettle on. You just sit. Let me take care of you tonight. It felt strange being cared for. For so long, Ruth had been the one holding everything together. But that night, she let Elias tend to her. He made her tea and brought her food, talking about simple ranch matters, until the sharp edges of her sorrow softened. Thank you, she whispered. Partners, he said. That is what you called us. And for the first time since she arrived, Ruth slept through the night without a single nightmare. She woke at dawn to find coffee already made and a note from Elias telling her he would handle the morning chores. She took that gift of time and sat on the porch watching the sun come up. She finally decided to believe what Elias had said. Living was the real courage. When Elias came back, he found her in the garden, pulling weeds with a new determination. You look better, he said, a hint of relief in his voice. I feel better, she replied. Or at least I feel whole enough to work. What you said about honoring the dead by living well, it has stayed with me. I need to do something that matters. I keep thinking of those orphans back in St. Louis, and I cannot help them from here. But maybe we can build something right here on this ranch. Not an orphanage, but a place that supports more than just us. A place that gives work to people who need it and offers safety in these hard times. Elias sat down beside her, his interest caught. What are you thinking? I am thinking this land could support more cattle if we managed our water better. We could build more housing and hire folks who need work, especially other women like me. She looked at him directly. If I cannot save the people I left behind, maybe I can help the ones who come next. Does that make any sense? It makes sense, Elias said slowly. It is also a mighty big ambition. We are barely managing as it is. We are managing because we are thinking small, she replied. What if we thought bigger? She led him to the small office and spread his records across the desk. Look at your water usage. You are running it to only 3 places. But this map shows the arroyo cuts through our entire eastern boundary. If we built a series of smaller troughs along it, we could graze cattle in pastures we are not even using. More cattle means more income. He leaned over the map. That is rough country, but possible. The cattle would be hardier, worth more. It would take money we do not have. Not yet, Ruth corrected. If we sell 10 head now, we would have the money to invest. A small loss now for a big gain later. He looked at her with new respect. Tell me, am I wrong? Is this impossible or just difficult? He studied the maps for a long time. It is difficult. Very difficult. But, he said, looking up, it is not impossible. There was a new light in his eyes, a sense of possibility. The best things usually are difficult, she said. He finally gave her a full, genuine smile. All right, let us do it. But we start small. 1 new water station to prove it works. Agreed. That night they talked over dinner with the energy that comes from a shared dream. They were no longer just 2 people surviving. They were partners, building a vision that belonged to them both. I should have asked you for help weeks ago, Elias said. You see things I miss. And you see things I miss. That is why a partnership works. Ruth paused, then said quietly, Thank you for last night, for letting me break down without making me feel weak. You are the strongest person I know, Ruth. 1 night of tears does not change that. I do not feel strong. The strong ones never do, he replied. That is how you know they are the real thing. Ruth finally asked the question she had been holding. Did Deste cry when things were hard? She expected him to shut down, but he answered honestly. All the time. Apache women are not raised to hide their feelings. Deste used to say her people treated emotions like the weather, something you experience and survive and learn from. He smiled at the memory. She cried, she laughed, she yelled. It was honest. You always knew where you stood with her. Do you wish I was more like that? No. His answer was quick and firm. I do not wish you were anyone but yourself. You feel things deeply too. You just show it differently. And different is what I need now. I need someone who is not trying to be Deste, but is completely herself. I am glad you can talk about her, Ruth said. That you still love her does not threaten me. It makes me trust you more. A man who loves that deeply is a man who takes love seriously. He crossed the small kitchen and stood before her. Can I ask you something? Do you think you could love me? Not right away, but someday. Is it possible? She thought about his patience and his quiet humor and the way he had held her while she cried. She thought about how safe she felt, how much more herself she was here. I think I already do, she said softly. Not the dramatic kind from books, the practical kind, the kind built on respect and trust, the kind that grows slowly but has deep roots. Elias let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. That is the best kind, the only kind that lasts. Is it enough after Deste? It is different, he said. But different does not mean less. My love with her was a fierce, bright fire. What we are building is steadier, quieter, strong enough to weather a storm. He reached out and gently tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. I think I needed both kinds of love in my life. We will learn together, he said. No rush, just partnership. Just partnership, Ruth agreed. The next morning, they began work on the first water station together. This clay filters the water, Elias explained as they worked on the cistern. My uncle showed me some. The rest I learned by doing it wrong until I got it right. Around noon, the sound of several horses made Elias go still. That ain't a friendly sound. Nobody comes way out here for a social call. 3 riders appeared over the hill. 2 rough-looking men and a woman with hard, watchful eyes. The man in the lead, who had a long scar through his eyebrow, stopped his horse a ways off. He looked from the cistern to Elias and then gave Ruth a long, assessing stare. Heard the half-breed finally got a wife to stick around. Came to see for myself. Before Elias could react, Ruth stepped forward. My name is Mrs. Crow, she said, her voice like ice. You will use it if you are talking about me. The man, Carson, just grinned. Well now, a feisty one. I am Carson. We work the Morrison spread. Heard you might be looking for hands come spring. Ruth was stunned. They had only just discussed it. Word sure traveled fast in this country. Morrison is selling his entire spread to the railroad, Carson explained. That is 40 hands out of a job, including us. We know cattle and we know construction. Experience does not make a man trustworthy, Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. Why should I hire you? His brother Tom spoke up blunt and to the point. Because good hands will not work for an Indian. That leaves you with folks like us who are desperate enough not to care. I care about honesty, Ruth cut in before Elias could explode. The woman, Grace, finally spoke. We have worked for Morrison for 3 years without causing a lick of trouble. We need the work, and we are telling you straight. That is as honest as it gets out here. Ruth saw the desperation behind their tough talk. They were on the edge, betting everything on the hope that she and Elias were just as desperate for help as they were for jobs. How many of the Morrison hands are worth hiring? Ruth asked. Maybe 10 or 12, Grace admitted. The rest are just drifters. We are not hiring today, Ruth said, her voice firm. But you can come back in 3 months. If we are ready, the pay will be fair, and the rules will be strict. Any disrespect to my husband, and you are gone. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Mrs. Crow, Carson said, tipping his hat. We will be back. After they rode off, Elias let out a long breath. That was a mighty big gamble. You just invited the whole county to our doorstep. Or we just found the workers we need, she countered. Now they have to compete for the jobs. We will get the best of the bunch. Elias shook his head, but a smile finally touched his lips. I cannot decide if you are brilliant or just plain reckless. Can I be both? He chuckled. With you, I reckon you can. That night, their dream felt different. It was no longer just about them. They were building something real, something that might just offer a future for more than just the 2 of them. This is bigger than just responsibility, Elias. This is scary. Ruth said gently. You're afraid that if we grow, you'll become just another boss man, exploiting folks instead of building something that matters. He stared at her. How did you know? Because I'm scared of the same thing, she admitted. But here's the deal. We decide what this place becomes. We build it on our values, fair wages and respect for everyone. We'll make something we're proud of. That's mighty idealistic, he said. So was marrying a stranger folks said was cursed. Idealism's worked out for me so far. Elias finally laughed, breaking the tension. All right, your way. But we hire slow and fire fast if there's trouble. As they finished the first water station, word spread. Workers started showing up, curious about the ambitious couple at the Crow Ranch. Ruth handled them all with a directness and fairness that earned their respect. When water finally flowed into the new cistern, the gamble had paid off. It works, Ruth whispered, a little stunned. It works, Elias confirmed. We can move 10 head of cattle out here next week. He gestured toward the mountains. And one day we'll build something that lasts longer than us. Ruth took his dusty hand. We're actually doing it. As they rode home under a spectacular sunset, she realized this place wasn't just his anymore. It was their home, built on shared effort and a shared dream. For the first time since her children died, she was building toward a future, not just surviving the past. And that felt like everything. The success brought more than cattle. It brought people, folks looking for work, some so desperate they'd work for just a roof over their heads. But it was a single rider on a cold October morning who would test everything. Ruth saw him coming from the south, an Apache man who sat his horse with a quiet authority. He stopped his horse 30 feet away, his old eyes studying her. You are the one who stayed, he said in a deep voice. I'm Ruth Crow, and yes, I stayed. The others ran from my nephew. You did not. I have come to see if this is courage or foolishness. A light went on for Ruth. You're Elias's uncle. I am Nachi, the old man said, dismounting with a smooth grace. Inside the house, his gaze fell on the beautiful weavings made by Deste, Elias's first wife. He touched one gently. She was my sister's daughter. He turned his sharp eyes on Ruth. And you are not jealous of a dead woman? No, Ruth said honestly. His ability to love that deeply is why I trust him. Erasing someone's past doesn't create a future, it just leaves an empty space. A flicker of approval crossed Nachi's face. You are wise. What has taught you this? Loss, Ruth said quietly. I buried a husband and 3 children. Grief doesn't disappear. You just learn to live with it. Nachi nodded slowly. Come, show me this ranch my nephew builds. As they walked, Ruth explained their plans. Nachi listened, then asked, what happens when white men who hate my nephew must take orders from him? Or from you, a woman? We can't control their respect, Ruth answered. We can only control whether we keep folks who show disrespect. We will always choose principle over profit. For the first time, Nachi smiled, and it changed his whole face. My nephew has chosen better than he knows. Just then, Elias rode up. He froze in the saddle, seeing his uncle. Nachi spoke in Apache, and the tension visibly drained from Elias's shoulders. He answered in the same tongue, gesturing at Ruth. Whatever he said made Nachi let out a deep, genuine laugh. He says you have a mind for chickens, Nachi said, his English slow and measured, and that you calculate water faster than he can write it down. He says you make him want to build something that will outlast both of you. Coming from him, that is high praise. Ruth felt the heat rise in her face. He is prone to exaggeration. No, Elias said, his voice low. I am not. Nachi explained he had come expecting to find another failure, another woman running from his nephew's wounded heart. Instead, I find you. I thought he would try to make you into something you are not, like the others. He tried to protect them from the hard truths of this life. That is what destroyed his marriages. It was his own fear. He was so scared of loss, he put them in a cage built from love. And of course, they left. Elias just stared down at his plate, his jaw set like stone. "You have told me this before." "Listening is not the same as believing," Nachi replied, turning his gaze to Ruth. "But with this one, I see something different. She is not protected. She works right beside you, taking risks. I heard you fought a coyote with a stick." A small smile touched his lips. "You have learned that a partnership requires letting go of control." "Slowly," Elias admitted. "The urge to keep her safe is always there. Fear wearing the mask of care. That is the lesson." Ruth took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Nachi, can I ask you about Deste? Elias told me she died in childbirth. I need to understand if I'm fighting the ghost of her death or just his general fear of loss." The silence that followed felt heavy as a stone. "My nephew blames himself for her death," Nachi said finally. "She and the child both died. He had been learning the white man's medicine and believed he could make the birth safer." Ruth looked at Elias and saw the confirmation in his devastated expression. "You tried to deliver the baby yourself." His voice was a bare whisper. "The midwife was 2 days away. The labor came on early. I thought I knew enough, but I did not. I made everything worse. She died because I was arrogant." "Or she died because giving birth is dangerous," Ruth said, her voice firm. "My own children died from a fever. My husband did everything the doctor told him to do. But when they passed, the doctor blamed my husband. The guilt destroyed him. Sometimes terrible things just happen. Blaming someone does not change what happened." She held Elias's gaze, her own unwavering. "Her death is not proof that you should not try to love again. It is proof that sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts." Elias's eyes were wet. "What if I fail you too?" "Then you fail," she answered simply. "But I would rather live a full life with the risk of loss than live a half-life because we are too scared." Nachi then spoke to Elias in Apache, a long, quiet speech. When he finished, he explained to Ruth, "I told him you are a gift, a woman who understands that love and loss cannot be separated. I told him Deste would want him to honor her memory by living well, not by wasting years being afraid." Later that night, sitting on the porch in the biting October cold, Elias finally spoke. "I am sorry I never told you the full truth about Deste. I was ashamed." "Shame is a useless emotion unless it changes your behavior," Ruth replied, pulling a blanket tighter. "Honor her by being honest with me, by building something with the life you have left." After a long silence, Elias spoke, his voice raw with emotion. "I am terrified of losing you, Ruth. With her, I did not know what I had until it was gone. With you, I know exactly what I will lose." Ruth shifted closer and took his hand. "Then we are even, because I am terrified too. I buried my entire family once. The thought of doing it again makes me want to run. But living alone, safe but empty, is worse than the risk. You taught me that." "How did I teach you that?" "You stayed here for 9 years. You could have given up, but you kept building. That takes a kind of courage." "That was not courage. That was just not knowing what else to do." "Sometimes courage and stubbornness look the same," she said softly. "You were moving towards something. You just did not know it was me." "I was just the stubborn one who dug his heels in. The others weren't weak for leaving, Ruth. I'm the one who made it impossible for them to stay. But that is not who you are now. You let me help with the water station. You listened to my ideas. You just held me when I was grieving for St. Louis. You have become the kind of partner you were looking for. We changed each other, Elias. That is what a real partnership does." They sat holding hands in the quiet dark. A coyote howled, and Elias tensed up before making himself relax. "I need to tell you why the other brides really left," he finally said. The first one, Mary, she left because I told her she could not go to town by herself. I said I was protecting her, but I never explained why. I just said no and told her to trust me. She was gone the next morning. And Eleanor, the second one, she left because I refused to let her help with the cattle. I made excuses to keep her at the house, telling myself it was for her own safety. She left because there is nothing lonelier than being protected from your own life. He took a breath. Catherine, the third one, only made it 4 days. I would not talk to her. She would try to start a conversation and I would just disappear. Living with a silent man is lonelier than living all by yourself. The fourth one, Sarah, she was a lot like you. She wanted to build something with me. But when she suggested changes on the ranch, I shut her down cold. I was too scared of losing control to accept a partner. And the fifth, Julia, she was kind and patient. But I was always comparing her to my destic in my head. Nothing she ever did was right. On her 6th day, she told me she could not compete with a ghost, and she was right. Ruth listened, seeing the pattern clear as day. So it was not about them. You were not ready for a partner. You were still trying to control everything so you would not get hurt again. Yes. By the time I wrote the agency for the 6th time, I was desperate enough to tell the truth. I told them I needed someone who could handle hard work, isolation, and a broken man. I expected you to run just like the others. I did not run because I was different, but you were different too. My friend Nachi had been helping me see where I'd gone wrong. He told me to stop looking for someone to put up with me and start becoming someone worth having. When you got here, I was trying to be that man. I met you halfway. I just needed you to be honest and willing. Elias turned to her in the starlight. I have to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Are you staying because you want to, or because you have nowhere else to go? Ruth thought about it. When I first got here, I was staying because I had no other choice. You are right about that. But somewhere between fighting off coyotes and learning to count cattle, that all changed. I stopped staying because I had to, and started staying because I wanted to. This ranch, this life with you, this is my first choice now, even knowing about all the others, especially knowing. It means you understand that building something good takes more than one try. Your 5 failures show more courage than most folks ever find. Elias pulled her close, and she leaned into his warmth against the cold October air. I am going to try to be better, he said. I will talk more and trust more. I will fail sometimes, but I will keep trying. And I will try to be more patient with you. We are probably making promises we cannot keep, but we are making them, and that is what counts. They stayed out there until the cold finally chased them inside. For the first time, Elias walked her to her door and kissed her forehead goodnight. Thank you for staying, he whispered. Ruth went into her room, her heart pounding. A line had been crossed. There was no going back to just being polite partners. They would either build something real or break completely. But Ruth had always run toward a challenge, and she was not about to stop now. In the morning, she found Elias and Nachi speaking softly in Apache over coffee. Nachi stood when she entered. I am leaving today, he said. I go back to the reservation with a lighter heart. My nephew has finally found his way. This is good. We could use your wisdom when we expand, Ruth said. He smiled. I will be back in the spring. By then you will have plenty of new problems to solve on your own. You two see things clearly. That is a rare gift. He put a hand on Elias's shoulder, said a few words in Apache, and then mounted his horse. Before he rode off, he looked at Ruth. Take care of my nephew. He is more fragile than he looks. He takes care of me, too, she replied. That is what a partnership is. Yes, you understand. That is why you will succeed. Then he was gone. Something had settled between them. He liked you, Elias said. Nachi does not like many folks, but he liked you. Do you want to know what he said in Apache? Only if you want to tell me. He said, this one will stay through the storms, nephew. Hold on to her. Then he said, the 8th day has come. Stop counting and start living, Ruth smiled. He is right. The testing is over. So what is next? Whatever we decide to build together. So what about us? Ruth asked, her hand finding his. It felt natural now. He met her question with a slow, genuine Texas smile. I reckon we stop acting like polite strangers. We stop being so careful and start living like we mean to stay together. That is what comes next. I can do that, he said. I want that. Then let us start right now. And they did. The walls between them crumbled. They worked with a new easiness, their touches free, and their words open. That evening, Elias led her by the hand not to her room, but to his. The room overlooked the land they were building together. At the door, he asked, "Are you sure?" It was her last chance to turn back. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. As they crossed the threshold, Ruth felt a flicker of hope. It was not a desperate hope, but a steady one, a belief that tomorrow would come, and she would be there to see it. Outside, the stars did not care about their joy. But inside, two people who had survived the worst decided that surviving was not enough. They chose to truly live. The next morning, Ruth woke up and saw Elias standing by the window. He was watching the sun paint the mountains gold and purple. His shoulders were tense. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked softly. He turned, his face filled with wonder and fear. "No," he said. "I am just trying to convince myself that this is real, that you are real, that I will not wake up and find you gone like all the others." Ruth sat up, pulling a blanket around her. "I am not the others, Elias. When are you going to believe that?" "I am trying." He sat on the edge of the bed. "Every time I believed something good would last, it was taken from me. After so much loss, you start to believe you are the problem, that you are fundamentally unlovable." "What if the truth is that you are not unlovable?" she asked. "What if you were just loving people in ways that did not work?" Elias thought about that. "Nachi told me I was so scared of loss that I tried to control everything. And control is not love." "He is right," Ruth said. "Is. But you are missing the point. I am staying because we are learning together. I am staying because you let me see your fear instead of hiding it." "What if I fail?" he asked. "What if I fall back into my old ways and push you away?" "Then I will push right back," she declared. "We will argue if we must, and then we will figure it out. That is what partners do." Elias took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "I do not know how to be this open, this hopeful. It feels like standing on a cliff." "Then we will fall together," she whispered. He kissed her then, a gentle kiss full of this new beginning. When he pulled away, some of the fear had left his eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Today is 7 days since Nachi left. That number 7. It has a history for me. 7 days is how long every other bride lasted before they ran. It is the breaking point." The truth finally clicked for her. "You have been counting the days," she said, "waiting for some curse to make me leave." "Yes," he admitted. "Deep down, I was waiting for you to decide this was all too much." Ruth held his face in her hands. "Elias Crow, you listen to me. I am not leaving today, or tomorrow. The only way I am going anywhere is if you physically drive me off this ranch yourself." "What if this is it? 7 days," Elias said, his voice tight with a fear that went bone deep. "No," Ruth told him, firm and steady. "We are not waiting for trouble. We are not counting down the days. We decided to trust each other, and that is what matters." He let out a shaky breath, finally letting himself believe her. "You are right. I am being foolish." "You are being human," she said softly. "After 9 years of loss, it is hard to expect anything different. But we are writing a new story now." As they worked on the fence line later that morning, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. Elias went rigid. "Easy now," Ruth murmured. "We knew they were coming. This is the next step." Elias watched them approach. "Or it is the test to see if we can trust them." The riders dismounted without being asked. "Mrs. Crow," Carson said, tipping his hat. Looks like you are serious about this expansion. You hiring? We are hiring, Ruth answered before Elias could. But we are particular. We need folks who work hard and treat everyone here with respect. If that is a problem, you can leave now. An older man with scarred hands spat on the ground. You expect us to take orders from him? He asked, nodding toward Elias. You will take orders from both of us, Ruth said, her voice like ice. This is our ranch. Any problem with that? The conversation turned to the railroad buying up land. They came to me too, Elias said quietly. Offered me a fortune for my water rights. I told them no. The older man looked surprised. Why turn down that kind of money? Because this place is not for sale, Elias said. What I have built here is worth more than money. Something in the older man's face changed. Fair enough. My name is Wilson. I have worked cattle for 30 years. I need fair wages and a dry place to sleep. Can you give me that? We can, Ruth confirmed. Pay is $40 a month with room and board. You will follow orders from either of us and you will pull your weight. Break the rules and you are gone. After a long walk around the ranch, Ruth made her decision. I will hire 3 of you, she announced. Wilson, Grace, and Sarah. Carson, you and Tom are not what we need right now. Carson's face grew dark. We rode all this way for nothing? You came to be measured, Ruth corrected him. And you came up short. That is not nothing. That is a lesson. After Carson and the other man rode off, the new hires went to get settled. Elias found Ruth in the barn. That was something to see, he said, his voice full of pride. I could not have done that. I worry too much about being seen as the angry half-breed. That is their prejudice, not your reality, she said, leaning against the stall. We will give them a chance to prove they can be decent. Ruth then laid out the work ahead, explaining that the first few weeks would be brutal. No one backed down. Good, she said. Welcome to the Crow Ranch. Do not make us regret this. How do you not care what people think? Elias asked her later, pulling her close. Oh, I care, she said. I just care more about building this ranch with you than I do about the opinions of strangers who already hate us. Their peaceful moment was shattered by angry shouts from outside. They rushed out to find Wilson and the new woman, Sarah, arguing fiercely by the water pump. I have been working ranches since before you were born, girl, Wilson yelled. Doing something a long time does not mean you have been doing it right, Sarah shot back, her chin held high. What is going on here? Elias demanded, his voice cutting through their argument. She wants to change the plans for the new water station, Wilson said. I told her it is not her decision to make. Some folks are haunted by ghosts. For Elias, it was a number. 7. 7 days was how long anything good in his life seemed to last. Now, on the 7th day of a new life with Ruth, they'd hired their first crew, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. This ranch was their dream, but old fears die hard. This is the story of how 2 people learned that you can't build a future if you're still living in the past. Stick around to see how a tough-as-nails woman and a crucial choice turned everything around. The trouble started when a new hire, Sarah, pointed at their carefully laid plans. Build there, she said flatly, and the whole thing will wash out within a year. The slope is wrong. She told them to move the water station 50 yards upstream. Elias and Ruth took a hard look. They saw the water lines from past rains and ran the numbers in their heads. She's right, Ruth declared. Move it upstream, and we use the natural rock. It'll be twice as sturdy. Their foreman, Wilson, looked sour. So we're just taking her word for it? We're taking facts over ego, Elias said calmly. Good engineering is what builds a ranch, not pride. Wilson stormed off, and Sarah looked at them with newfound respect. Most bosses would have just done it their own way, right or wrong. Most bosses are fools, Ruth said. We pay you to see things we miss. Speak your mind. That's how we grow. Sarah nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. I think I'm going to like it here. Good, Ruth replied. Because you'll work hard, be paid fair, and we'll always listen. That's the deal. That first dinner with the crew felt strange. Their quiet home was now filled with strangers watching every move. Elias was quieter than usual, the old walls going back up around him. Later, while washing dishes, Ruth finally broke the silence. "Talk to me, Elias. What's wrong?" He sighed, putting down a plate. "I hate this, Ruth. I hate having people in our home watching us. It doesn't feel like ours anymore." "It's still ours," she said softly. "We're just sharing it. This is about control, isn't it? What Nachi warned you about." "It feels like I'm losing everything," he admitted. "You're not losing it," she said, moving closer. "You're sharing it. And that's a risk, I know, but we have to trust people to build this dream. We can't let fear shut us down before we even start." "I'm trying," Elias said, his voice full of exhaustion. "But every bone in my body wants to send them all home and go back to it being just us." "I know that feeling," Ruth assured him. "But you have to ask yourself, is this fear based on a real threat? Or is it just an echo from the past? These folks have done good work. The fear isn't about them, Elias. It's about your history. And we can't let history run our lives." He pulled her into a hug, resting his chin on her head. "You're too smart for your own good." "I'm just learning to live with fear instead of letting it drive," she whispered. That night in bed, Ruth thought about the day. They had survived their first conflict. They had survived day 7. The old curse, if there ever was one, felt broken. But breaking a curse was just the first step. Now came the hard part, building something new from the wreckage of the past. The next few months would be a whirlwind, building the next station, hiring more hands, preparing for a cattle drive. It was a reckless, beautiful dream. But Ruth knew that playing it safe was just a slow way to die. It was better to risk it all for a life with purpose. Elias stirred, pulling her closer. She had earned his trust, just as he had earned hers, by being honest about their fears and choosing to grow instead of hide. They weren't just building a ranch or a marriage. They were building a true partnership where two whole people could stand side by side. That was worth any risk. Even if they failed, they would fail together, and that was better than winning alone. As she drifted off to sleep, that thought kept her warm. Tomorrow would bring its own set of troubles, she was sure of it. But tonight she felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. She felt home. Just before sleep took her, she heard Elias whisper so quietly she almost missed it. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for day 8. Ruth smiled in the darkness. Day 8 was only the beginning. As long as they kept choosing each other over their fears, there would be a day 9 and a day 900. The curse was broken. Their future would be written by their choices, not their ghosts. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work. The new water station went up fast and true under Sarah's watch. Even Wilson proved to be a tireless worker. Then, late in November, the sky turned a strange, sickly yellow. Ruth felt the pressure change in her bones. She knew a brutal winter storm was coming. "We need to batten down the hatches," she told Elias as the horizon turned black. "This isn't just a little rain." Suddenly the sky turned a dark, bruised color. "That is something worse," Elias said, his voice tight. "A winter storm." They moved with purpose, a team against the coming fury. They drove the cattle to a sheltered canyon and secured the smaller animals. Elias double-checked everything, making sure nothing would freeze and burst. By the time the storm hit, they were as ready as they could be. The wind howled like an angry beast. Then came the sleet, turning the ground to a sheet of treacherous ice. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. They gathered in the kitchen, where the stove offered the only warmth. They were a small crew, 5 souls huddled together as the storm raged outside. Wilson worried about getting feed to the cattle. Sarah pointed out the danger. In this weather, the 3-mile journey was a death trap. But they were in it together, a family forged by hardship. Facing the storm is one. We cannot lose that herd, Elias argued. Those 30 head are everything we have. If they die, this ranch dies with them. Ruth listened, the weight of their future pressing down. This was the reality of their dream. Every choice was a gamble, with disaster as a possible outcome. She finally cut through the tension. We wait for morning. If the storm breaks, we take them feed. If not, we wait. We can lose cattle, we cannot lose our people. Wilson chimed in, saying the herd would not last 2 days. Ruth's voice was firm. And we will not last 10 minutes in that blizzard. We wait. That is final. Her unexpected authority settled the matter. Later that night, Elias found her staring into the blackness. "You made the right call," he said softly. She worried. "Did I just pick the easier way to fail?" He turned her to face him. "You chose people over property. That is never wrong. We will survive losing cattle. We would not survive losing a friend." "I am scared, Elias," she admitted. "One storm could undo everything we have built." He held her close. "Then we will build it again. That is what we do, together." "What if I am not strong enough?" she whispered. "Then I will be here to help you. That is what a partnership is. You do not have to be perfect. You just have to trust me to be there." He smiled. "You believing in me is what made me finally believe in myself." In that quiet kitchen, as the storm howled, she found a sense of peace. They would face whatever came, together. Morning arrived, gray and vicious. The storm had weakened, but only just. Elias returned from scouting, his face grim. "It is bad, but it might be possible. The wind is down some." "I am going with you," Ruth declared, pulling on her winter gear. He started to protest. "Do not," she warned him, her eyes flashing. "We are partners. We face the danger together. If you go, I go. End of story." Elias looked at her, truly seeing the strength he had come to rely on. He finally nodded. "All right, we go together." They loaded the wagon and tied themselves together with a rope. It was a brutal journey. The wind cut clean through their clothes, and the ice made every step a fight. Twice the wagon nearly slid off the trail. Both times their combined effort was the only thing that saved it. But they made it. After 3 grueling hours, they found the cattle, huddled and hungry, but alive. It took another hour of dangerous work on icy rocks to get the feed distributed and break the ice on the spring for water. By the time they finished, Ruth was exhausted and frozen. But a deep satisfaction warmed her. They had saved the herd. Their future was still alive. Getting back was a whole lot harder than getting out. The blizzard raged, and you could hardly see a thing. Ruth's horse hit a slick patch of ice and went down, sending her flying into a snowbank. For a second, she was lost in the white, but then Elias was there, pulling her free. He asked if she was hurt, his hands shaking. She told him she was fine, just needed a moment to catch her breath. Elias insisted they could only rest once they were home. They pushed on until the ranch buildings finally appeared through the swirling snow. Inside, Grace had hot soup ready. As they warmed themselves by the stove, Wilson asked about the cattle. Elias, teeth chattering, said they were sheltered and would be all right. Grace, reading the sky like an old book, promised the storm was already breaking. She was right. The next morning revealed some downed fences and a leaky roof, but nothing they could not handle. The herd was safe, the ranch stood strong, and they were all alive. That storm taught Ruth something important. She learned she could make the tough calls of a leader, and that letting Elias help her was not weakness, it was trust. They had survived because they were stronger together. In the weeks that followed, the ranch hands started treating them differently. Wilson began asking for her opinion instead of questioning it. Sarah brought her ideas for the spring, treating them like real partners. They were finally becoming a team, and the ranch was better for it. Everyone's skills came together to pull them through the winter. Sarah cleverly used the spring melt for irrigation, and Wilson's experience meant they lost only 2 cows. By March, the Crow Ranch was no longer just a struggling homestead, it was a thriving business. But the biggest change Ruth saw was in Elias. He started trusting others with tasks and listening to new ideas. He even smiled and laughed more often. One evening in April, she found him on the porch watching the sunset. She took his hand and told him what was on her mind. She said they had to expand the ranch or they would fall behind. They would need more cattle, more workers, and another cabin. That meant more money. Elias listened quietly, taking it all in. He pointed out that it was ambitious and expensive. They would need to take out a big loan to pay for everything. She told him she knew. Elias reminded her that a loan meant betting the entire ranch on their success. If they failed, they would lose everything. He asked if she thought it was worth that kind of risk. Ruth squeezed his hand and said that playing it safe was its own kind of gamble. She believed they had to grow, but only if he agreed. It had to be their choice. After a long silence, Elias looked at her with a new certainty in his eyes. He said, "Let's do it." They would build something that would last, something to prove the town wrong and provide good jobs for people. As they sat there planning under the stars, Ruth realized this was not just Elias's ranch anymore. It was theirs, their land, their dream, their life together. The next morning, Ruth woke up feeling different. Her stomach was uneasy and her senses felt sharper. Then the realization hit her all at once. She was pregnant. The news was a dizzying mix of pure joy and deep-seated terror. Elias found her sitting on the bed and immediately knew something was wrong. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes and told him they were going to have a child. She saw shock, then joy, then a wave of fear wash over his face that was even greater than her own. He sat beside her and took her hands, asking if she was certain. She told him her body knew. He pulled her into a tight hug, admitting how terrified he was after what had happened before. She confessed she felt the same, having already buried 3 children of her own. Finally, Elias looked her straight in the eye. He promised that this time would be different. They would get the best doctor, no matter the cost. They were not taking any chances. "You can't treat me like I'm made of fine china," Ruth told him flatly. "I will keep on working and living my life, just with more care. That is the deal." Elias argued that she could not lift anything heavy. "I will not," she promised, "but I can still run the books and oversee the crew. Being pregnant does not make a woman useless." He finally admitted his real fear. "I just cannot lose you, Ruth. I barely survived losing my first wife. I would not survive it a second time." She took his face in her hands. "Then we will do everything to make sure that does not happen. We will be careful, and we will be smart." As word got around, the whole town seemed to have an opinion. One afternoon, Mrs. Bledsoe showed up, full of advice. "A woman in your condition should be resting," she insisted. Ruth just smiled. "I appreciate your concern, but a woman in my condition is perfectly capable of managing her own ranch." "It is just that folks worry," Mrs. Bledsoe said, looking a bit ashamed. "But if you need anything, you just have to ask. No woman should have to face childbirth by herself." After she left, Sarah made a wry comment. "Funny how the town cares now that you're carrying a crow child." Ruth knew it was not about her, but about the baby. Still, Sarah had a point. Having experienced women nearby was just smart planning, even with a doctor coming from St. Louis. Pride was one thing, but a safe delivery was another. Meanwhile, the ranch was growing, but so was their debt. The loan they took out was huge, and the worry kept Ruth up at night. "We are not going to fail," Elias would tell her, his voice solid as oak. "Failing is not an option, so we will succeed. It is that simple." His certainty became her own. By the time fall arrived, the ranch was a different place, with more buildings, more workers, and a herd of 50 cattle on good pasture. When Ruth's labor started one crisp October morning, she was not alone. Elias was there, and so were Mrs. Bledsoe and other women from nearby ranches, their old prejudices forgotten. When things got complicated, it was the doctor's modern knowledge and the women's hard-won experience that saved both Ruth and the baby. Just after midnight, a healthy baby boy announced his arrival. "He has your eyes," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion as he watched Ruth hold their son. They named him Daniel, after Ruth's father. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and pure wonder. Ruth found a strength she never knew she had. Elias learned that he could live with his fear. He chose to love his wife and son, knowing how fragile life was, because a life without that love was no life at all. As Ruth recovered, they shifted from working the ranch to managing it. They had good people they could trust with the day-to-day chores. One snowy evening in late December, they sat by the fire with baby Daniel sleeping between them. "Do you remember your letter?" Ruth asked. "You said you needed a partner, not a decoration." Elias looked at her. "Did I get what I needed?" She smiled. "I think we both got more than we ever bargained for. I came here looking for a way to survive, but I found a life worth living." Elias took her hand. "I was looking for someone who could put up with me. Instead, I found someone who saw me for who I was and chose me anyway." His voice was heavy with feeling. "That is more than I ever figured I deserved." "You deserve everything, Elias," Ruth said softly. "You always did." That evening, they watched their sleeping son, Daniel, by the fire. Snow fell softly outside, a temporary beauty covering the harsh land. Ruth thought about her journey from a grieving widow in St. Louis to a rancher and a partner. She remembered the 5 women who had come before her and fled. She could have been the 6th failure, but she chose to stay. She chose to fight for a real partnership, not just protection. She chose life. They had built more than a ranch. They had built a new way to love based on truth and vulnerability, not old stories. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked gently. She smiled. "I am grateful I stayed. Choosing you was the best decision I ever made. Our son will grow up seeing what a true partnership looks like, and that will make him a better man. He will learn that partnership means 2 whole people choosing each other, not one person fixing the other, just 2 people building something better together." Elias lifted her hand and kissed it. "I love you, Ruth Crow. I love you for staying, for fighting, and for believing in us when no one else did." Tears of pure happiness filled her eyes. "I love you too, for letting me in, for learning to trust, and for becoming the partner I needed." Daniel began to stir, ready for his mother. The curse of the ranch was broken. In its place was something real, something earned with hard work and honesty. It was not the fairy tale she might have once imagined. It was better, because they had built it piece by piece together. As she went to feed her son, she knew they would face every future storm the same way, as equals, as partners. They had built a beautiful, ordinary life. It was not a fairy tale. It was just 2 people who had known terrible loss and chose to risk loving again. The half-Apache rancher, who everyone said was cursed, had found his partner. The widow from back east, who everyone swore would run, had instead planted deep roots. Together they proved that the best stories are not about perfect people. They are about broken people who find each other and build something whole. The fire that had chased away 5 other women now kept this one warm. It was not magic. It was the simple, hard choice to stay when leaving was easier, to trust when trust was terrifying. Ruth had stayed. Elias had let her in. Their life together was the reward for that courage. It was a family created from hope. It was a future they wrote themselves. It was enough. It was everything. It was home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.